All right, so today we're starting a new unit. We finished with our unit on Japan. I know it was quick, but given what we have to cover over the course of the year and how long I've been gone, it means that we're going to have to move a bit more quickly than maybe I want to. We're moving from Japan all the way back to Europe. And if you remember where we left off in Europe, we left off in the Middle Ages. We talked a lot about feudalism. We talked about kings, knights, and peasants. We talked about how it was dark. These were dark ages, and the fact that there was little advancement in science and technology, and that there was a lot of warfare between small kingdoms. And so we're returning back to Europe, and we're getting out of the Dark Ages, and we're going into this period called the Renaissance. And Renaissance is just a fancy word that means rebirth. So the idea is that when something is reborn, it goes back to a previous way of living that's better. So if you have had a rough period in which you've been hanging out with some bad friends or something, and then you decide to make a change and go back to hanging out with people that make you feel good and are better friends, that would be a kind of rebirth. You know, a lot of people talk about it in terms of religion. So some people in their religion believe that when they make a profession that they're belonging to this religion, they're reborn as a new person. So all these ideas, a lot of them come from the Renaissance and a lot of them come from religion. But Renaissance just means that this period was about going back to thinking about things in another way. And we're going to talk about what that looks like, but I just wanted to talk about the word before we got started. So now let's go back to the Dark Ages so we know why the Renaissance happened, because it happened because of the Dark Ages. So this is all review, but you should be familiar. So Rome fell, the Empire of Rome, not the country. Rome would still exist actually until 1000 AD, just the country. But the empire, meaning their control over most of Europe, that fell in 476 AD. So you remember the barbarians came in. After many years of decline, the barbarians were the final nail in the coffin that ended the Empire of Rome, and Europe went into the Dark Ages. What that means is all the civilization that Rome had created came to a close when Rome could no longer control its empire. So there's many people that would say the Dark Ages lasted from 476 to 1000 and things started getting better. There's some people that think it lasted all the way until 1500, so over 1,000 years. But it lasted somewhere between 700 and 1,000 years. It's called the Dark Ages because there were very few advancements in science and technology. Because people were just trying to survive because this empire had ended, they didn't have free time to really focus on art, exploring science, creating new things. This period was all about survival, and these different groups of people, these different countries, figuring out ways to survive. And so that's why it's called the Dark Ages. Basically, it's a period in time in which little advancement in science, technology, math, art, religion really moves forward, and most of the time is spent purely on, do we have enough food to eat? Is someone going to kill us today? Those basic survival things. And when you're worried just about those things, it's hard to think about things like, is there a better way to solve this math problem? So additional reasons why it was dark. There were frequent famines. It's an alliteration, same letter twice. Frequent famines means that there was shortages of food often. And shortages of food happened for a lot of different reasons, but the main one is that before, under Rome, you had a whole empire producing food. But now that there's all these different small governments throughout, and you guys can look at the map right there and see them, they had less ability to get food from other places. So let's say, for example, your farm runs out of food, but your neighbor had a good season. You could buy food from him, and then the next year pay him back, and then maybe the next year he has a bad year, and then you can help him out. But if it's just you and you're just by yourself, then there's a high probability that you could run out of food. Second thing that made it dark is lack of education. So it was a lot more important to have a classical education in ancient Rome, but since people were more focused on survival, education then became really only for religious priests and monks, and the average children just progressed right into farming or being a soldier or whatever it might be. There was little room for education in a world that was all about survival. There are frequent wars between these various kingdoms. There's a lot of conflict over land and who controlled land. And because there are so many different kingdoms and the boundaries between them are often contested, meaning that the boundaries between them, people don't agree on them. There are frequent wars between various kingdoms for control of this terrain and these lands. And then, of course, there was pandemics. Pandemic is a word that means when there's a disease that spreads to a large area. We talked about the Black Death that came through Europe through the Silk Road before. Black Death is one of them, but there are many other plagues of diseases that killed, in the long run, millions of people. And so you guys can see why many people refer to this period as the Dark Ages. All right, so what is the Renaissance about? What's the basic idea? Well, in order to understand what the basic idea is, we have to understand what humanism is, because this is the big change in people's thinking about the world. So humanism is a philosophy that says humans are the center of the world, and that we should really focus on humanity and improving humanity. Before this, people believed that God was the center of the universe, and the full focus should be about honoring God. And so to put the focus away from God and on humans and improving humans as opposed to honoring God better is a big change. Religion was the main reason why people believed this. They believed that God was the center of the universe, and so as a result, because God is all-powerful, you should put your full attention on God. But as people started to look to themselves, this philosophy developed basically that reoriented people, so changed their focus away from the religion that they've been taught to themselves. And so as a result, people began focusing on human achievements. What could we do as people? So those achievements might be in writing, they might be in art, they might be in science, they might be in math, they might be in medicine. We'll talk about how people try to understand the human body better. But the basic idea with humanism is two things. One, it's a movement away from the idea that God is the center of everything and that should be your sole focus. And then two, it's a movement towards the idea that humans are the most important thing in the world. And so today in our world, we already, many people are religious, but even religious people spend an inordinate amount of time just thinking about humans and how to improve themselves and how to get better at things. And a lot of that comes from a humanist philosophy. And so even though we don't know that word until just recently, you're probably using some of the terms that were created by this philosophy just when you talk about maybe getting better at your jump shot at basketball. So what caused this change to humanism? Well, Europeans began receiving copies of ancient Roman and Greek texts from Byzantium. So the Byzantine Empire had ended, and so some refugees from the Byzantine Empire began bringing documents from ancient Rome and Greece that focused on these ideas of humanism, about how to make a better person, about philosophy, about how to live. And these ideas began causing people to think and read and explore new ideas that were different from what they were receiving from their religion. And the most important part, though, was this invention of the printing press. So even if you had a great idea or a different idea, it was hard to spread it because if you're just using your own voice and there's no internet, there's no phones, there's no nothing, you can really only spread it to the people you live near. But if you put it down in a book, you could give that book to someone and they can read it and they can develop the idea or learn about the ideas. Um, but before the printing press, you had to copy these books by hand. You had to literally sit down at a desk and go line by line, side by side, your eye moving left to right, and copy word for word. And so making copies of the book was very difficult. But this man, Johannes Gutenberg, developed this printing press, and to break the word down is to print is to write, and a press is basically it's a giant lever that pushes down a giant stamp, essentially. So it's making a giant stamp of your book. So you would create a page, stamp 1,000 copies, create the next page, stamp 1,000 copies until you stamp out the whole book. And so people were able to make many, many copies of books and spread these ideas of humanism further. So who was paying for all this? Well, the Renaissance began in cities where there was people who had extra money. One of the most famous cities is Florence, Italy. And so these wealthy families that in these cities, and they were typically merchants, people that bought and sold goods, would pay to support artists and intellectuals. These artists and intellectuals would do things for them, like paint portraits of their families, and they would use the free time that their patrons or supporters gave them to create their own art and ideas and writing. So one of the most famous patron families of these Renaissance artists and intellectuals were the Medicis. And the Medicis ruled Florence for over 60 years, and they supported artists that you know, like Leonardo da Vinci, the painter of the Mona Lisa, and Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel, were supported by this family. And so a lot of who we can really thank for the Renaissance is these wealthy families who put money towards enabling these artists to have the free time to create their art. So the Renaissance is really driven by people, ultimately. Individuals who created art and ideas and use these art and these ideas to show the world these new forms of belief like humanism. So in art, some of the famous geniuses of this time period were people like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. In science, you have Galileo and Copernicus, the people that changed the way we look at the stars. In literature, you have Shakespeare, Dante, Chaucer. In philosophy, you have people like Hobbes and Descartes. And all of these famous thinkers are people that you will meet over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks as we study this more, and you will learn about how their ideas changed the way the world thinks and ultimately have trickled down to you and the way you see the world. So here's some pictures of different kinds of art that were created during the time period. So these two paintings on either side were painted by Leonardo da Vinci. There's a sculpture of Da Vinci in the center. And what you'll notice about Renaissance art is that it's focused on realism, meaning it is the first time period where the attention to making the picture look as much like the subject that it is painting. So they wanted the appearance of reality in the pictures and not for it to be like some other, weird world. They wanted it to be an accurate representation of this world. And so they focused a lot on shadows. You guys can see the use of shadows in these pictures. You guys can see how they're quite realistic. These are paintings by Raphael. You can see the one on the left is a little bit more realistic than the one on the right. A lot of these artists did spend most of their time painting religious art, but the real passion was creating art of people and realistic pictures of people. This is the famous Sistine Chapel in Italy. You guys can see it is one of the most beautiful sights you can ever see. I've never been myself, but They say you can go there and spend a whole day just looking up at the ceiling and getting lost in the world that Michelangelo created. This is a sculpture of David. Michelangelo also was a sculptor, and you can see what we talked about creating realistic art right here. You can see his bones, you can see his veins. It is as realistic a sculpture as you can find. Architecture was also a big thing in the Renaissance, creating architecture that was beautiful and symmetrical. This is the famous dome created by Filippo Buscinelli. You guys can see its beautiful symmetry and also the art that was in the center of the dome. This is Copernicus. Copernicus is really the one we have to think for our understanding of the solar system and the fact that the sun is at the center. It was believed for a long time that the Earth was at the center and the rest of the planets revolved, and the sun revolved around the Earth. And it was a big transformation in belief to believe that the sun was at the center, and it was very controversial. These are drawings of human anatomy created by Leonardo da Vinci. Because humanism is focused on humanity, it was important for people to begin to understand how humans are made and what they're made of, and their different muscles and tissues. And so this is Leonardo da Vinci's sketches based on autopsies of dead bodies. And of course, there is literature, books. You all know one of the most famous writers of this period, Shakespeare. His tragedy of Hamlet is on the left there, and then that is a picture painting of Dante, who wrote many books about different spiritual worlds during this time that are still read today. All right, some effects of the Renaissance. Now remember, this is just an overview. We're going to cover these things all in much more detail, but for now, we're just exploring the broad overview so you can get a big picture of what's going on. So the first effect had to do with this period called the Reformation. So religion would begin to change as more people had access to Bibles. Remember, Johannes Gutenberg printed Bibles, or Bibles were being printed. And so old religion, people just listened to their priests. Their priests were the only ones who had the Bible, and so the priests would tell the people what the Bible meant. But the Reformation began to happen when people began to read the Bible for themselves, and they could see that not everything the priest was saying was in the Bible. And so as a result, people wanted to change and improve religion. And people also wanted to have their own relationship or access to God and not have to go through a priest to access religion or God. And so we'll talk about this more, but it's really, you can see, going back to humanism, a lot of it's to do with being focused on people and people's needs and people's wants. And so the individual's wants to have a relationship with God were emphasized over the priest telling what people to do, telling people what to do. Then you also had the age of exploration. So some pursued learning and improvement through exploring the world. There were many devices that were created during this period. We'll talk about those more at another time when we cover this in more detail. But for now, just know that a lot of these new devices were about navigating. There weren't maps of the world. There wasn't GPS. There weren't Apple products to help us navigate. People had to navigate based on stars, winds, the coastline, and things that made it challenging to get an accurate picture of where you live or where you were in the world. And so these journeys that people went on with these new navigation devices were about trade, partly, so about money, but also about exploring the world and getting to know the world. So hopefully this was interesting to you. The Renaissance is a very interesting period in the world's history, and I think it's worth knowing because a lot of the things that you believe come from this period, and it's important to understand those. And so this was again a broad overview. We will cover these things in more detail. Finish your quiz.